Welcome, everyone. It's noon here in the Washington, D.C. area, and it's a sunny, beautiful day. Thank you all for being with us. My name is Ilham Nasser. I'm the director of the Human Development Program at the International Institute of Islamic Thought. The Human Development Program at the International Institute, IIIT, is part of the initiative on advancing education in Muslim societies. We started this program last year in April in 2020, where we invited speakers that would speak, talk, present, and share their research on different topics and themes related to development, related to learning, adult development, youth development, and related to specific theories. But we also presented our own research, which we call the Mapping the Terrain research, part of this initiative that is really focused on advancing education in Muslim society. We call it AIMS. And so if you would like to get more information about our pieces, our research, we will put the link in the chat. But today we're here to celebrate the research that has been done by two prominent scholars that I think have targeted topics of interest to our audience at IIIT, but also topics of interest and importance for all of us. We have two panelists today. We have Ashley Kirtan and Tasneem Mandiwala, and both of them will speak and present their research. We will start with Dr. Ashley, and I will introduce her bio, followed by her presentation. And then when she's finished, I will introduce Tasneem, and Tasneem will share with us her research. So this is how this is going to work. Ashley's presentation is going to be on refugees, newcomers, parents to the block, facilitators and barriers regarding Muslim refugees, parental involvement in Chicago public schools. Ashley comes to us as a provost postdoctoral fellow and lecturer in the School of Education and the Department of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. She has received a PhD and master's degree from the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice at the University of Chicago. She also received graduate certificates in forced migration and refugee studies from the University of Oxford and Northwestern University. Prior to graduate school, she worked as a research associate at Northwestern University Institute for Policy Research, where she implemented and evaluated Check and Connect, comprehensive student engagement intervention, focusing on school completion, social competence among immigrant students in Chicago public school. Ashley served as a community fellow through the U.S. Department of State in Izmir, Turkey, serving as an instructor at a local elementary school. Her research has been published in Urban Education, the Urban Review, and the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. She will explore the educational and mental health needs and outcomes of refugee and migrant children and youth and their families. She has done that thus far, and her presentation today will focus at the group of refugees and the parents of group of refugees and their involvement in school systems in Chicago. Ashley, welcome again, and thank you so much for being with us. And we will start with your presentation. And please remember, we will make sure each one of you is 20 minutes. You have 20 minutes, allocated 20 minutes, and then we will continue from there. Thank you again, Ashley.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Are you able to see my slides? Okay, awesome. All right, let me do this. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for the introduction. I am excited to connect with all of you in this virtual world. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this talk. Excited to be here today. The title of my presentation is The Newcomer Parents to the Block, Facilitators and Barriers Regarding Muslim Refugee Parental Involvement in Chicago public schools. And so you've already heard my background. I'm certainly happy to connect with folks offline. I am definitely at Hopkins at the moment. I will be transitioning to an assistant professorship in the School of Social Work and School of Education at Michigan. And so I will continue to explore some of the themes that are covered today. And so I am excited to be in this space with all of you. So let me give you a general overview of the structure of the presentation. So first, I will give you some context around my research interests, as well as I will present on one of my dissertation chapters that was later published as a manuscript in the Urban Review. This is a shameless plug. Please read the article. You're only going to get a little taste of what this topic is about. But I've explored some of these themes in more depth in the article. And so afterwards, I imagine if you have questions throughout, any clarifying questions, please feel free to let me know, but there'll certainly be a Q&A at the end, which I hope will yield a robust discussion. And so as a researcher, I identify as a refugee, migration, and international education scholar who explores the social, emotional, linguistic, and academic development and experiences of migrant and refugee youth and their families in the US and abroad. And so once again, happy to talk about what kind of led me to this work. But I've had the opportunity to work in international and domestic contexts with refugee and migrant populations in countries like South Africa, Morocco, Jordan, Turkey, to name a few. And so I've also worked with refugees in the States in refugee resettlement agencies in the Midwest. I also was an intern through the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UNHCR. So this is a topic that's near and dear to me. I will go through a few slides to ensure that everyone is on the same playing field when it comes to like who a refugee is, and then I'll transition into my research. And so, who is a refugee? So a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee their country due to persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. They typically cannot return home. And so they have to they have locally integrated into countries nearby. So let's say someone is in Syria, they normally integrate into countries neighboring it, like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, etc. And so that's the group that I typically work with, especially children. And so to give you more context, at least 79.5 million people around the world have been forced to flee their homes. Among them, there are nearly 26 million refugees, around half of whom are under the age of 18. As of 2020, 1% of the world's population have fled their homes as a result of conflict or persecution. And so in a US context, since 1975, the United States has accepted more than 3.3 million refugees for resettlement. Despite the sharp decrease during the Trump administration, this should be no surprise, there were travel bans for people who were from Muslim majority countries. Over time, we still have resettled more refugees than many other Western countries like Canada or countries in Europe. And so in 2018, for example, it is estimated that 34% of all refugees resettled by the United States are school-aged children between the ages of 5 and 18 years, which once again is why I prioritize this group. Obviously, children, they don't live in isolation. They're connected to parents and to other family members. But this is the population that I prioritize in my research. So what is parent engagement? This is intuitive in many ways. We've heard this term before. In education literature, it has been explored quite a bit. And so just to have a general definition, parent involvement typically refers to the multiple ways parents may support their children's learning and achievement, usually through direct involvement with their children's schools. Now, this is once again a very Westernized, a very US-centric way of defining parent involvement. And we'll talk about this a bit later, but this is not a universal definition or an expectation in other contexts. And so I'm at Johns Hopkins. I am using a framework that was developed by a scholar in the School of Education, Joyce Epstein. And so she develops a framework to think about 6 types of involvement for school, family, and community partnerships. We won't dig into it too much, but I wanted to give you all a sense of how I was thinking about engagement. And in terms of my study, how the experiences that the parents that they talk about, how it maps on to this existing framework. And so the framework, it highlights the role of parenting and how they establish certain roles or certain priorities in the home, communication, so their overall engagement with school staff, teachers, the students' peers, et cetera, and how often that communication occurs. Volunteering, so this could be being active in the PTA or in other aspects of their children's education. Learning at home, so what is happening at the home in terms of completing homework assignments and other work. Decision making, so do they have a role? Do they have a say? Do they have a level of agency at the schools? And then finally, collaborating with the community. What is their overall presence in the community? Do they volunteer at certain activities outside of the school? Another framework or theory that drives my research is this ongoing debate around assimilation versus integration theories. Just to give you a heads up, assimilation, that typically isn't, that theory isn't elevated anymore. In fact, there's a lot of pushback in academic spaces. But in practice, it is still something that many people expect when migrants or refugees come to the US, this idea that they are supposed to adopt the ways of US culture and fully become a part of a different society. And so my work is certainly pushing back on that and embraces more of an integrationist type view that which is defined as incorporating individuals from different groups into society as equals. And so for my refugee and migrant families, this idea that they're not abandoning their cultural roots or background, and that the schools, because I'm focused on school research, that they are also privy to some of the cultural norms and practices, and that they are adapting and adjusting to meet the needs of the family. That is the perfect world. That would be the ideal situation. As you can imagine, that doesn't always happen. And so, but these theories grounded the work that I'm doing, and we'll see how that comes out in the findings that I'll share with you shortly. Just another thing to note, integration suggests boundaries. It is defined in terms of equality. But in this context, equality indicates that a host is obligated to embrace foreign cultures as equal, even when they conflict with the values and traditions of the host. So I wanted to share that context as well. All right, so the critical role of schools. I don't think anybody's going to argue that schools matter. If you do, that's a separate conversation. But schools matter for all youth. As you can imagine, for refugee and migrant youth, schools serve as one of the first and most influential institutions experienced by youth. It offers a supportive space for social interactions and access to resources. It provides opportunities to learn about the majority culture and builds relationships with staff and peers. Schools are also very important for parents, and especially as you think about their involvement and their modeling the importance of education to their children. What existing research shows is that it is essential for integration. It bridges cultural and language gaps between home and school. It builds social and cultural capital among refugee parents with similar identities. And it encourages refugee youth to develop positive relationships with school, staff, and peers. Now, although it's been deemed as important, I think it would be difficult to find people who would say, no, it's not. There have been challenges with refugee parental involvement in schools. Now, as a side note, there's also challenges with US-born families being involved in schools. So some of the findings that I'll share today really can be applied to numerous marginalized communities. Obviously, we're going to pinpoint things that make this group more distinct in some of their challenges, but I just wanted to make that note. So the literature states that language barriers serve as one barrier, that pre-migration trauma or psychological stress related to adapting to the US also serves as a barrier. And then finally, cultural differences and a general lack of knowledge can serve as a barrier for many families. All right, so if we had more time, and I love more time, and I love to talk about my research, we would delve into both questions. But for today, we're going to highlight the second question. What are the facilitators and barriers for Muslim refugee parents' engagement with schools? So some of you may be wondering, well, Ashley, why did you pick this group? Well, as you heard in my bio, I've worked with refugees, with Muslim refugees when I did work in Turkey. I also did some work in Jordan and a bit in Iraq. And so I've worked with this population before in an international context, as well as the US. So I was working with these populations before I did this study. My work is community engaged research. And so definitely was learning more about some of the issues. My work also overlapped with the Trump administration. And so in addition to those things, The research shows that there's been a high number of hate crimes directed at Muslim students. There's also a fear of terrorism that dominates public and policy discourses. Muslims have been deemed as religious outsiders of the 21st century. And then finally, Iraqi and Syrian refugees are the two largest groups of resettled refugees in the US. Obviously, that number was different during the Trump administration, though they plummeted actually. But before that, there was a growing large Iraqi refugee population, and there were more Syrian refugees being resettled to the US. I imagine during the Biden administration, those numbers will increase again. So as I mentioned, this is a community engaged research framework. And the idea of that is I employed an interpretivist paradigm based on the assumption that social reality is not singular or objective, but rather is shaped by the human experiences and social context of the people you're studying. So for this paper, I'm prioritizing parents' meanings and understanding of their children's schooling experiences. As mentioned in the title, this study was conducted in Chicago public schools. And this is the third largest school district in the US, and it has 18.7% of students who identify as a refugee or immigrant. Despite the large numbers, there's been a long history of disengagement or a lack of support for English language learners. In terms of the sampling, 19 Muslim refugee parents were in the study. There were 18 mothers and one father. Most of the interviews were conducted with the mothers. 11 refugee parents were from Syria, and the 8 remaining parents or mothers were from Iraq. As I mentioned, I worked close. It was a community engaged project, and so I worked closely with the Immigrant and Refugee Resource Community Center. I changed the name to protect their identity. And I changed it to a very long name too. I don't know why it's so long, but they were very instrumental in helping with the research design, recruitment, data collection, and data analysis. And the interviews were conducted either at the center or in the participants' homes. The interviews lasted between 45 and 60 minutes. The participants, they received $25 gift cards to Target. A translator was available to accommodate this process. If we had more time, I would actually walk through what that looked like, but it really was a partnership in that I worked with the translator before, during, and after the interviews to ensure that I was capturing information accurately. All right, let's get to the good stuff. So in terms of facilitators, the first facilitator, and this shouldn't be surprising, and frankly is probably consistent with a lot of families, is the importance of a welcoming and inclusive school environment. And then the second one is a shared racial, ethnic, I would even say legal status or some familiarity with the plight of refugees was also important, especially if there was a shared identity. So for the first one, in terms of the welcoming and inclusive school environment, an example of this, the principal and school staff at June High School, and usually I go through like where the children and the parents attended, but for the sake of time, I don't have time to do that. But June High School was a more welcoming environment, typically for refugee and migrant families. The principal met with the refugee parents to learn about their individual backgrounds and to anticipate what supports might be needed from the school. So Talora stated, I think the school is good. Even their teachers, I like them. Like one day last year, there was an accident at the school with my son. The school called the ambulance for him and they called me right away. So everyone was involved, even the principal, the assistant principal, the coach, everyone. They calmed me down and they made sure someone could speak to me in Arabic when I didn't understand English. So a welcoming environment was paramount to this family. In this quote and other quotes that are in my paper, the families acknowledged that the school staff, if they didn't identify as Arab or a refugee, they still had some familiarity with their plight, with the arduous journey that they had to go through to get to the US, with their identity as Arab or as Muslim, and that there were some struggles with that, especially with the current political climate that we were living in. They were privy to some of that. They were also adamant about making sure they had Arabic speakers on board to help the family if they wanted to converse in their native tongue. A second one was related to racial ethnic identity with school staff. And so a Syrian mother whose son attended June High School also described how the principal had prior knowledge of the refugee crisis and was also extremely accommodating. So this, once again, some of the other quotes that I won't bring up today, some of the school staff identified as Arab or as Muslim, and they also, so the students were able to connect with the school staff in a special way. They didn't feel like they were invisible, and that the school was intentional about hiring school staff that had similar identities as the students. Once again, that's not always feasible. And so some of the schools that couldn't hire people or didn't prioritize that, they definitely made an effort to actually hire people who understood the language and the experiences. In terms of barriers, lack of English language proficiency is a common thread. And so I won't highlight that, but it certainly reinforces what's in the literature. But students' academic success and bullying and discrimination from school staff also served as barriers. So some of you may be thinking, well, academic success, that's great. Some of the parents expressed that they were less involved in schools if they perceived that children were doing well academically. And so this sheds more light on some of the customs and norms that are practiced in other countries. And in this context, in some of the countries I've noted, like in Turkey or Jordan or in Syria. And so schools are just there. They serve a different function. And so parent participation may look vastly different or may not be prioritized in the same way, or at least operationalized in the same way. And so one of the parents said, my daughter is doing well in school, mostly A's and B's. She is a good student. She helps out the family. I don't need to go to the school. If she starts performing badly in school, then I will go, but she's good for now. And so all of the parents expressed the importance of education. That was never a question. But in terms of the heightened importance that we put on parent participation in the US and the defined roles that we put on families, it was a departure from what some of the families were accustomed to in their home countries. And so there was typically a departure or some confusion or concern. Now, mind you, the schools may not be privy to that. So if teachers or school administrators are thinking, well, this family just doesn't prioritize education, then as you can see, there's a little disjuncture there. And then finally, bullying and discrimination. Sadly, you all may be privy to this already. My study only reinforced that. Half of the parents describe feelings of anxiety or fear for their children's safety and well-being due to acts of discrimination or bullying. And this was connected to their identities as Muslim. And so I won't have time to go through the quote, but just know that some of the language that was offered by students as well as school staff definitely heightened or elevated some of the issues around xenophobia and Islamophobia that exist in our society, in the US society in general. And schools are only a microcosm of that energy or of that negative rhetoric. And so some of the students were bullied because of their identities. And so that, as you can imagine, many parents, they started to disengage from the schools as well as their children if they felt that the school administrators did not tackle that, or once again, if the general culture or climate was toxic. So finally, just thinking back to the parent engagement framework, it would be ideal to kind of expand how we frame or think about engagement, and to think through how other cultural groups maybe look at it, if they prioritize it, what should be what we should consider in terms of the cultural differences and backgrounds. And then also thinking about this notion of assimilation, once again, which is typically abandoned in education research, but integration, and thinking about a two-way process. How can schools engage families so that it truly is a two-way process and that families feel supported? And then once again, the facilitators, a welcoming and accommodating school environment is paramount. And then school staff and teachers that have a shared racial, ethnic, religious identity or possess prior knowledge of the migration experiences of the families was important, especially of Muslim students and some of the political and toxic rhetoric and environment that they're experiencing outside of the school and in the school was extremely helpful for families. And then once again, barriers around English language proficiency and their children's academic success. And then once again, the bullying and discrimination committed by children and school staff also served as a barrier. These are some implications. I won't touch on that, but obviously, I'm a practitioner, and so I always think about what are the practice, policy, and research implications of my work, which I can talk about in the Q&A. And voila, thank you. I received support from the Fosbeck Fund for Research and Experimentation, Max QDA, and the University of Chicago to support this work. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ashley. It's not only that you touched upon a very important topic and very relevant and timely, but you also highlighted and increased our awareness, at least mine, regarding some of the specific issues that refugees in this country face. I think Chicago is probably a sample of issues that are dealt with across the nation. So thank you, and I look forward to asking some questions during the Q&A. Now we move to Tasneem, Dr. Tasneem Mandiwala. And Dr. Tasneem is a cultural psychologist and intersectional feminist scholar who earned a PhD in comparative human development from the University of Chicago in 2019. She has an MA, Master's in English Literature from the University of Houston, and the BA in Psychology, Art History, and English Literature from the University of Houston. She has earned a certificate in Gender and Sexuality Studies from the University of Chicago. Her main research areas are the cultural and identity development of minority individuals in the US, with special emphasis on Muslim American women. She views her teaching, research, and professional experiences as modes of activism to raise awareness about marginalized populations in both academic and mainstream audiences. She is also a visual artist and creates pieces that explore the human relationship, constructed and natural spaces. I'm so curious about this part, Tasneem. That's not the focus of today. Today's talk will be about being while becoming, roles of resiliences in young Muslim American women's identity development. Thank you, Tasneem, and the floor is yours. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ilham, and thank you, Ashley, for that amazing and super interesting talk. So let me go ahead and share my screen.
While you share, please, if you have questions, write them in the chat or the Q&A.
Everybody can see the slideshow? Excellent, thank you. I am going to be speaking incredibly quickly because I have a lot to cover, and as Ashley was also sort of indicating, there's a lot of information, and even before I begin talking, I'm going to let you know I'm not going to be able to cover it all, but again, hopefully we'll get into that during the Q&A a little bit. So thank you all for being here, either out of choice or out of mandatory attendance. Some of my students are present, so I'll go ahead and get started. So my talk is called Being While Becoming, Roles of Resiliencies in Young Muslim American Women's Identity Development. My main research question was, do young South Asian Muslim American women experience developmental risks unique to their socio-cultural positioning as such that other adolescent and emerging adult groups in the US do not? Hang on, something happened to my screen. Bear with me a moment. Okay, excellent. And a clarification. So I had not set out to do research on specifically South Asian Muslim American women, but as is typical in social scientific research, the nature of participant sort of call and response, the majority of my participants ended up being from South Asian ethnicities. And so the conclusions that I draw in this talk and in my study are specific to South Asian Islamic culture. However, I did have participants from different Islamic cultures and ethnicities, and there were overlaps with their experiences as well. But the only thing that I can, with any degree of certainty, sort of make conclusions or draw conclusions about is this specific culture. And so when I do say Muslim American during this presentation, I'll be referring specifically to South Asian Muslim American. So the short answer to the question is yes. The longer answer is that there are shared risks with groups that I'm calling umbrella groups, which these young women also fall into. And one of these groups are young American women. Another group is second generation immigrant individuals. And when I say second generation, I mean individuals who are born in the US to parents who immigrated here from other countries and other cultures. And then finally, the third group they overlap with is minority groups in the US in general. So that includes racial and religious groups. But there are also unique risks that shift across age groups. I looked at 3 different age groups. Today, I'll only be discussing adolescence and emerging adulthood. I also included adulthood, and I limited it to women in their 30s for the sake of the study. Of course, adulthood does not only span one's 30s. But adolescence, I defined as roughly between the ages of 11 through 18. Erik Erikson is the kind of like recognized as the foundational adolescent development scholar. And so I drew from his definition, although as we'll see, his work didn't necessarily cover multicultural or minority non-white experiences in the US. And then in emerging adulthood, I define emerging adulthood as between the ages of 19 through 29. Emerging adulthood is a much more recent development in developmental literature. It was coined by Jeffrey Arnett in the early 2000s. And he himself, as a scholar, recognizes that the majority of the work has been done on white middle-class individuals in college settings. And so part of the intent of my work is to question whether or not emerging adulthood is a viable developmental period that we can really apply to Muslim American women, which I found that it was, but B, how the definition of emerging adulthood might shift and how we might define it in new ways. So I want to cover why this is a gendered study and why I sort of approached it in the way that I did. One thing I will say from the beginning is that all of the women I spoke with did identify as women. No one was non-binary or did not identify as a woman. So I will be referring to all the individuals I speak about as women. The majority were heteronormative, although there was a small percentage of queer and lesbian participants. Having said that, so what are the 3 main reasons why gender was so critical and why I thought it was such an important research area to sort of delve into? Well, first of all, women are expected to be the bearers and transmitters of culture in American culture, in Islamic culture, in South Asian culture, in multiple cultures across the world. And what does this mean? Basically that, and this goes into the second bullet point, that young women's behavior is much more monitored and controlled than young boys and young men's behavior, because they're seen as sort of protectors of culture. And so how a young woman behaves is seen as reflective of the culture at large. Now, if a young woman is handed different sociocultural scripts from different cultures they're members of, this can lead to obvious conflict in identity development. And to use forgive me, but to use a very jaded example that often lacks nuance, but I use it because this still maintains presence in mainstream American understanding of Muslims and Muslim women in particular, is the example of how Muslim women are expected to be obedient, or Muslim women are expected to be somewhat quiet and focused on sort of upholding family values, versus what American women are encouraged, mainstream American women are encouraged to be, which is of course more independent and perhaps aggressive and more open. And then finally, the third bullet point about why I wanted to focus on gender is that simply there's a need for an intersectional examination of the Muslim American experience. The majority of research on Muslim Americans to this day has been about Islamophobia, which is very real, as we'll see, but it also ends up sort of moving the stereotyping and the experiential stereotyping in another singular direction. So while Islamophobia is important, and gendered Islamophobia in particular for young women who might present as Muslim through wearing a hijab, there's obviously much more to a young Muslim American girl's experience than simply Islamophobia. And I think gender is a critical starting point as well, because the research that has been done on Muslim women usually focuses on clothing. So again, an important aspect of their experience, but not the only aspect. So very briefly, I do want to spend a large amount of time on the research itself. I am a qualitative researcher, and I thought that was particularly critical for this population because Muslim women's stories have been sensationalized or sort of simplified. And I think the only way to rectify that in both mainstream conversations and academic conversations is to actually allow the individual's voice center stage. And so I will be reading, I apologize in advance, but I will be reading somewhat lengthy quotes to you. But before I get into that, briefly, the methodology and the theoretical grounding. I interviewed 68 participants, semi-structured interviews, and then I had brief questionnaires, which basically recorded demographic information and had a few sort of diving off questions for the interviews. I performed this research between 2014 and 2017. So like Ashley's work, my work also overlapped a little bit with both the Trump sort of campaign process and also the administration itself. I recruited by simply asking for young women who fell in the age brackets that I specified, who I self-identified as Muslim American. That was my only sort of recruiting factor, second generation Muslim American, I should say. So I didn't ask whether or not they wore the hijab. I didn't ask whether or not they attended any particular religious services or anything like that. As long as they self-identified as that, I invited them in and we spoke. So the methodology that my interviews were coded on and sort of the driving force behind the interviews themselves was the phenomenological variant of the ecological systems theory. Not a mouthful at all, right? But for short, PVEST. And this is an incredibly useful theory for, in my opinion, in general, for social scientific work, but particularly when we're looking at a population that hasn't had sort of developmental and identity factors really explored to any nuanced degree. We're not going to go through this entire model that you're looking at right now, but I do ask you to take a look up in the upper left-hand corner where it says vulnerability level, and notice that vulnerability is a combination of risk contributors and protective factors. So it's mutual, it's interacting, and also notice all of these beautiful arrows moving in every direction. Again, don't have time to get into the specifics of this, but what I do want you to take away from this is that this is an interactive, organic process that represents how the individual is essentially alive within a living context. And so the individual is always responding to cues and scripts that they receive from their environment, but they also are responding to that, right? They are also part of that environment. They are also establishing themselves as members of that environment. So let's get into it. Adolescents, what were the risks that we found? As I mentioned, the group overlaps. These are, again, young women between the ages of 11 through 18. So appearance was important to the majority of them. And this is, again, I'm sure many of you know that during adolescence, appearance and school acceptance, which is the next group overlap in terms of risk, is critical during this time. You want to be accepted by not necessarily your parents at this time, but especially by those that you're interacting with at school. And thank you, Ashley, for pointing out how important school is, because that's also relevant here. The next overlap with an umbrella group was the conflict with parental culture. And this speaks to the second generation immigrant group that I was referring to initially. And then finally, the risk factor of being othered or called, quote unquote, weird by your non-Muslim peers or non-immigrant peers. And this is something that is shared by other racial and religious minorities in the US as well. Group-specific risks to adolescence. So the first two that you're looking at are the stereotyping, international political and Muslim womanhood. International political implies what happened was that your non-Muslim peers would end up not associating you with an American identity or a US identity, but rather with an identity that was entrenched somewhere out there in the world, that was exotic, that was unknowable, but that was also somehow dangerous and very directly and explicitly linked to terrorism. Muslim womanhood, which, as you can see or mosque, for those who are not familiar. And growing out of this divided life space is the next risk, which is gender roles at home, which were often more pronounced than gender roles at school. For example, a girl's brother might be able to go out at night without their parents really questioning them, without really giving him a curfew, whereas the young woman would be told, oh, you need to be back by 9:30, no questions asked. The next factor was masjid boys and reputation. So these young women did not necessarily entertain the idea of dating at school or dating non-Muslim boys at school. So in some ways that reduced a certain aspect of peer pressure at school. However, they are still experiencing a certain degree of peer pressure at masjid in terms of wanting to maintain a reputation as someone who is not a flirt, because they did see their long-term romantic entanglement in their religious community. So if a young woman is seen as talking to, and literally when I say talking, just talking to a young man on one night and then talking to a different young man on another night, she might be depicted by those same young men as flirts or as quote unquote easy. And that presents a risk to her future potential romantic relationships, i.e. marriage, when she, a few years down the road. And then finally, another challenge that these young girls face is masjid friends, which is essentially just another universe of peer pressure and another universe of judgment, similar to the one that they're facing at school. So here's one of those lengthy quotes. I want to highlight the role of questions in the stereotyping. And so you can see Zainab at the top saying, I mean, you can just tell why they're asking. And so these young girls get accustomed to answering questions. And there was a spectrum of questions that went from genuine curiosity from peers or perhaps strangers, but less frequently from strangers, all the way to sort of the blatant harassment we'll see in this quote. So I'll go ahead and read this to you. This is, Nuria said this, and all the names have changed, by the way, to protect the participant's identity. Nuria said, last week I went to Burlington, which is a department store, and this lady, and I'm not sure if she was not okay or maybe a little bit sick, but she was kind of crazy. She just walked up to us and was like, so why are you buying that tank top? And I was like, I didn't want to answer at first because she doesn't need to know. I just wanted to walk away. But she was like, why are you buying that tank top? Because you guys are wearing the headscarf and all. And I'm like, we can wear it when we're at home. We don't have to dress like all the time. We can wear what we want when we're at home. She was confused and stuff. So I just wanted to make sure she gets it. She was standing there like, so how are you going to get a husband? And I was like, we have a way. She was kind of confused about that. And I just had to explain everything. And it took like 15 minutes. Plus the way she was asking, it felt like she wasn't even curious. It wasn't a good way of asking. She was like, so you can't do anything with your husband? You can't do anything with anybody before you get married? And I was like, she can't ask that. And my sister's standing right there next to me and she's like 13. So I don't have time to kind of break down this quote. And I hope much of what is problematic about what this stranger said to this young woman is hopefully obvious. But what I do want to focus on is the tension that Nuria is able to sort of be conscious of here, which is like, I don't want to explain this to you, this woman I have never met before, who's asking this incredibly invasive question. But at the same time, I recognize my place as sort of somebody who is able to explain this to you to perhaps prevent you asking this question to another young woman in the future. I'm going to skip over this quote, but this quote basically highlights the importance of school friendships and non-Muslim friendships to these young women as well. However, there is still a certain barrier, and we can just get that from the first sentence. Sometimes religion creates this barrier, but there is much understanding and enjoyment and love for each other. Now let's get into the protective factors and coping mechanisms. So the first two columns you'll see is what I've dubbed minimizing whatevering and enhancement whatevering, which is basically when the young women would be like, whatever. The minimizing would be like, whatever, I don't have to explain it to you, and sort of dismiss their Muslim identity and move on very quickly. Enhancement whatevering was more saying something like, whatever, this is who I am, you have to deal with it. And walking into a room and being like, whatever, I don't care about what you think, what do you have to say to me? And kind of bringing it up before the other person could bring it up and taking control of that situation. As you can see, sameness and shared experiences was the critical and overriding sort of unifying factor in terms of a coping mechanism and a protective factor. The quote at the bottom of the screen, so many of the young women said almost exactly the same thing, because like all of us go through the same thing, you know, we just get each other. It was about not having to explain the nuances of your identity to somebody and them just understanding it. And then the last protective factor was this idea of smartness. A number of the young women would note that they were academically high achievers. It wasn't necessarily an egotistical comment. It was just kind of, yeah, no, I'm really good at school and this is something that I want to do and that I enjoy. And this becomes important when we get into emerging adulthood. I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock. How am I doing? Are we okay? Okay, I'm gonna try and talk much more quickly. So the two factors during emerging adulthood are education and marriage, and emerging adulthood becomes much messier. So education and marriage can both be risk factors and can both be protective factors. So as you can see here from the numbers, obviously for the same individual, at one point, education was a protective factor, and then it became a risk factor, or vice versa. And initially, it is a protective factor because it's something that spans both cultural realms. Education is something that is encouraged by most, if not all, Islamic cultures. And it's also something that's encouraged by immigrant cultures. And it's also something that is obviously understandable to the American context in which it is being pursued. I'm going to skip over this slide, but maybe we can get into it in the question and answer. I want to direct you to the end of this quote, which highlights how geography is a risk in terms of not being able to pursue education necessarily far away from your family, and that sort of limiting your educational opportunities in some ways. So Bani, who was 24 at the time I spoke with her, said, my mom has a really big thing about if you're a girl and you're single, then you should either be with your parents, you either live with your parents, or at least in the same city as your parents, or you're married and you live with your husband. So there's no middle ground. There's no middle ground in her mind. So that's one point of major argument that we had at that time. Let's see, my screen won't go. Okay. And then education can also be kind of used as a coping mechanism after this. And so there's a rationalization of the situation. And Bani, again, that first quote is, it was for the best. I couldn't have had this kind of experience anywhere else. So in retrospect, it becomes kind of a positive experience. Then we get into the question of graduate education. And the important thing to note is that first bullet point that you're looking at, which is educational tensions increase with age if a woman is unmarried. And again, I'm skipping over some of this in the interest of time. I do want to take a moment to read Sakuma's quote, because this really highlights the very conscious tensions that end up developing. So she says, yeah, I feel like I've reconciled some of the Muslim and American pieces of higher education and getting married later in life, or like doing good for your community. I feel like the latter is a value in the Muslim community that I've taken on and want to live by. And in my experience or my perception of South Asian culture, those three things are harder to reconcile. Of not being married, of pursuing higher education, of doing something good for the community. It's like, but why? It's a little too superficial for me. I feel like I always have to be looked at. I have to look a certain way. I have to act a certain way. I have to be feminine, whatever that means. And I'm just not into it. Gave me the liberty to do whatever I wanted to do because I was no longer held prisoner to my parents' expectations or my parents' permissions. And so this highlights how it can shift for one individual. Again, I'll skip over this. This slide talks about what makes this uniquely Muslim American, and this slide highlights the group overlaps with other minority cultures that might experience similar marriage versus education tensions. And then these are the sort of critical differences. Look at this bullet point in particular as well, the desire for Muslim women to want to be normal, right? And by normal, I mean to want to sort of assimilate, if I can use that term, Ashley, into mainstream American culture to a certain degree. This work has implications for developmental, cultural psychology, and intersectional feminist literatures, because ultimately the question that I'm really trying to pick at is, what does it mean to be a successful adult woman or a person in one's society? And when the answers to this question are different in different cultures, but that one person is members of these different cultures, we end up with individuals in what I have called accidentally powerful positions, because it's the decisions that Muslim women make about their lives, about whether or not to go to school, whether or not to, fight the fight and leave their parents' household, even if they're not married, whether or not to wear a hijab, whether or not to have kids. All of these decisions essentially are going to shape what South Asian immigrant Islam, at least, look like in the US. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Ilham and Triple IT for having me. You're on mute.
Oh, I thought I'm unmute. Sorry. Thank you so much, Tasneem. And there is so much in your presentation that I would like to ask about and bring the different pieces together. I do see that nobody actually put anything in the Q&A, which means I can ask my questions unless people start writing while I ask. So I would like to start with Ashley and to thank you again for all the points you raised. I was wondering about your choice of Muslim versus Arab, and I'm asking specifically because, Iraqi, Syria, people assume that they are Arabs and Muslims, but there may be that they were Kurdish. And I have, with Syrian refugees, and I was surprised to know some of them were Kurdish because I couldn't tell, not from, the Iraqis, Kurdish Iraqis is a little bit different. So my question is just like semantics. What made you choose to say Muslim versus Arab? And my second question is more on the substance. From my experiences working with parents, I learned that because we don't know what parental involvement, we as immigrants, we as parents sometimes growing up in different places, we don't know what to expect from the school and what to expect give us back. And do you think that part of this, gratefulness, gratitude, respect to what the school gave these parents, that part of it is that their expectations were minimal as well? Or did you find it to be regardless? Were there some other things other than bullying that they brought up?
Yeah, so those are both really good questions. So in terms of the first one, and I didn't share this slide for the sake of time in terms of the inclusion criteria. And so for the families, once again, I was intentional about targeting Muslims because of some of the literature and some of the rhetoric that's used in the U.S. I would argue of many U.S. born families may not really know the differences between like Kurdish and like that. At the end of the day, and it's sad, right, that there's a lack of awareness around distinctions. I mean, this question even came up when I mentioned that there were some people, from Syria, who are Christian. People were like, wait, what? Right. So that's another conversation, but there is a lot of misconceptions and myths and, around like these particular groups. For the sake of the study, I did narrow it to Muslims because of the current political climate and the perceptions that a lot of US born people have about the groups. And so that was a criteria. Being so similar to Tasneem, I didn't originally set out for that group. I actually interviewed people who identified as Muslim from various countries. So I had people from Myanmar who were in my sample, who from South Sudan. Like there were people from other countries that were in my sample. I didn't highlight that in today's study, but I decided to narrow it a bit. And this was like a recommendation, but also I thought it would help not that they're a monolithic group, right? So someone from Syria and Iraq may have vastly different experiences, different identities, but they were closely related in terms of their regional proximity. And then once again, how US born people may perceive them, once again, not really understanding the distinctions between them. And so that was kind of what grounded, or what prompted me to kind of focus on those groups, was one, the perception, or that they typically get lumped together, or that the general US perception may put them in the same category. And then once again, Muslims being targeted, or there's Islamophobia and xenophobia directed towards this group.
So were some of your parents Kurdish, for example?
Yeah, so there were. So those were questions that I asked at the beginning of each interview for them to self-identify who they were. And so there were some, but a very small number of families. And then once again, I actually had this really comprehensive chart where I track all that. I didn't share it with you all, but once again, if there are some of you who are interested in some of the in-group differences and commonalities, and I think it's an important question and worthwhile when you start to disentangle, some of their responses and relationship to schools. The second question, I think it's a really good point, and actually that might be a really great theory or a reason why some of the families were disengaged. I know a similar reason, at least a lot of the families mentioned that, in their home countries, that, teachers are highly revered, and they are seen as the experts on the children and just youth development and education in general. And so they didn't typically ask a lot of questions because they felt like they were already being supported and mentored and receiving adequate education from the experts, from people who went to school to study development. And so that translated into how the families interacted with US schools and with their teachers, elevating them, which I kind of wish that was a practice in the US as well, that teachers were highly revered, and that also reflected in like their pay, but, and other standards. But a lot of the families stated, hey, the teachers, they understand even more so than me what my children need to thrive in educational settings. And so that was one. But your question also makes me wonder about their identity as a refugee, and them also feeling like, wow, I was, I experienced this traumatic experience. There's droves of people who aren't able to repatriate or return back to their homes or to resettle. And so there is a general sense of thankfulness, or that they're here and that their children can attend school. And so that, I haven't thought about that, but I think that's actually a really good point. So maybe some of these parents perhaps didn't feel, didn't want to express themselves, or that's not the word I'm thinking of, but maybe didn't offer more insight or guidance on what their children needed, because they're just thankful that their kids are there and that they're getting an adequate education. I like that theory. In fact, I like it enough that I'm going to ponder it some more, but that's my initial thought.
Wonderful, thank you. And Tasneem, do you have a question for Ashley before I move to my question to you?
Not currently.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ashley, for entertaining the two questions. I think they're, like you did say you don't have all the, slides and all the study here, but thank you for addressing these two questions. For Tasneem, I was thinking as you went through your presentation, I know that you said a few, the US Muslims in the US is in the hands of women, but I get the feeling Muslim women, at least in your sample, the ones I don't want to generalize, but in terms of the stereotyping, I get the feeling that they get it from the inside and outside circles. The insiders are, looking at them, oh, if you talk to someone, you're flirting. That's the Southeastern, Asian cultures, looking at them with the big, eyes and antennas, like we say. And then you have the outside stereotyping based on the clothing, based on the appearances, based on. So it seems like there are these internal struggles. What brought you to this conclusion that both within and without Muslim women are accidentally powerful position to shape the future of Islam? Say more about that. And I know you were rushed and you have a lot more to share, but an opportunity to expand on that. Maybe we can end this with a powerful statement about Muslim women.
Yeah, I hope so. And I genuinely think so. So as you said, they are under a lot of microscopes, multiple cultural microscopes. And one thing that makes this experience that I described specifically Muslim, specifically American, and specifically female and gendered is the forcing of having to grapple with these different microscopes. It's not a pleasant experience all the time, and it's not easy, and it adds psychological stress, as we saw, for example, in that longer quote I read about being at the store, as we, I didn't obviously get to share all of the quotes that I had in mind, but there's always a tension. One of the participants said she feels like she lives 3 different lives. And this awareness of living different lives in different spaces, again, while not easy to do, does increase a certain type of knowledge that I think young Muslim boys and young Muslim men are not necessarily privy to, that parents, first generation immigrant parents are not necessarily privy to, that non-Muslim female peers are not necessarily privy to. It's, if I can, reference back W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, this is in some sense a triple consciousness, and knowing that you are aware that you're this person in this context and this person in another context. And it's by trial and error. There's multiple uncomfortable experiences in adolescence where, again, these young individuals are forced to come up with answers on the spot that their other peers are not necessarily forced to do. And it does not matter what I'm wearing, or it does not matter what I eat or when I don't eat or any of these things. And that's how they're shaping it, because again, the people who are, for succinctness, I'll just say oppressing them or trying to control their behavior are obviously not intending to give them any kind of power. They're not and I use the word oppressing with a little bit of hesitance, because it's not necessarily with the intent of oppression, but the meaning making of it does sometimes feel like that to the young people. The young people do sometimes feel like they're being controlled more than they should be. And that's why I use that term. It's not a reflection of the intent, for example, of the immigrant parents. Yeah, so that's why I think like their behavior and being forced to make decisions that others don't have to make is what gives them that power, whether or not they want it.
Thank you, Tasneem. I think it's a wonderful insight on this whole idea of biculturalism, by living the 2 different lives in both presentations. Actually, I see that. I don't know, you call it assimilation, integration, salad bowl, or a mushy, dish. It's all, both of the presentation really address that. I want to give Ashley maybe an opportunity to give your final thoughts, or if you have a question for Tasneem, and then we'll end with your Tasneem, with your thoughts.
I just want to thank you for inviting me. I want to thank the community, the virtual community, for attending the talk. A lot of great issues were brought up. Tasneem, your study is amazing. So I don't have any pressing questions. I mean, I had like, because I like methods, I was like, oh, I wonder what this and that, but I can follow up with you offline. But this has just been an excellent opportunity. And once again, please read the article. I think that gives you more breadth about what the study was about. And I'm happy to answer any questions offline if people have it. But thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. And for both of you, before we move to Tasneem, there was a question for you, Tasneem, about your art, if you want to read it. But I just want to highlight to both of you and point out to the audience and the participants that we do have a Journal of Education in Muslim Societies, and we publish peer-reviewed, blind reviews of the publications and the manuscripts that anyone can submit. And so with topics specific to issues related to education, social development, and any aspect of life of Muslim communities and societies, wherever they are. So think about that as an avenue for your publications as well. Now, Tasneem, there's a question about your art, which I would like to hear about, and then maybe end it with some final thoughts as well.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to keep my comments on art as brief as I can. So I guess that's a very, very large question. And I would be thrilled to discuss this offline or in another meeting with anybody who is interested. But I guess a way that it might relate to what we've just been discussing is my journey about whether or not I want to present myself as a Muslim American artist specifically. I am Muslim American, but that doesn't, when I say I'm a Muslim American artist, that oftentimes immediately brings certain connotations to people's minds. It also immediately create certain requirements for what my art needs to cover and talk about. And so this is an ongoing sort of conversation I have with myself. So I have made bluntly political and bluntly Muslim and bluntly feminist art and works that I'm proud of and I stand by. But my current mode of working is a much more abstract and I'll say universal, although that word kind of makes me cringe sometimes, but and it more explores, I explore how we as a human race, as people, as individuals interact with both each other, but also our surroundings. So that includes this contrast that we've created between nature and civilization, quote unquote. And this sort of distinction, this line, this false line, in my opinion, that we've drawn between human and nature. And that's something that I play around with because I believe that humans are a part of nature and yeah, we create structures, but our structures are still susceptible to the ruins of time. They're not immortal. And I think we end up thinking of ourselves as somehow superior or immortal based off all of our human constructions. Not to demean or dismiss the wonderful accomplishments of humanity, but I think there's a pause that needs to be taken there. And so that's what I hope my current work is doing. And in terms of concluding thoughts, again, yeah, I want to echo Ashley's gratefulness and thanks to all of the attendees, to you, Ilham, for organizing this, to all of the people behind the scenes, the tech people, Hassan and Salwa, thank you very much. And I would just, I guess, say that I think we need to continue doing research on populations, on marginalized populations that perhaps have not had space for a voice in both academic literature and mainstream literature. But as we do that, to recognize that we ourselves can make errors, we ourselves can perhaps draw conclusions that may not be accurate, and be open to adjusting those conclusions, and be open to recognizing that even though we are we're highlighting certain patterns in certain populations, to always make space for individual difference within those conclusions. So thank you.
Very, very true. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Tasneem. Thank you, Ashley, for your time, for your insights. And hopefully we connected you again, both of you, so you could maybe collaborate on some other adventures and research. So I appreciate everyone. I appreciate Salwa and Hassan for the help and our attendees. But thank you for being with us all. And if you want to know more about our institute, it's the International Institute of Islamic Thought. Look at our education and human development programs and publications. And we hope that we can intrigue some of you to come again, attend, present. Just be in touch with me if you would like to present your work or recommend someone to present their work, and we can definitely consider that. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of the day. Take care. Stay safe.